Rennes made the same impression on me as Le Havre, except that there was less destruction. If my memory serves me correctly, it was mainly the buildings around the train station. The secretary of the Communist Youth Union in the department, Louis Coquier, asked to be transferred to the youth battalions without thinking about the danger to his life. He was 20 years old. He worked as a marker on the railroad, and he loved his fiancée Francette Coquerel. Like some, they could wait it out, live on their knees, but still live in slavery, but live. Louis and Francette, however, valued freedom and human dignity above all else. From 1940, communist leaflets were distributed in the department of Ille-et-Vilaine. In the Union of Communist Youth, they were prepared by Louis Coquier, a group of the special organization consisting of Pierre Martin and 2 other activists organized an explosion at the Latouche refinery in September 1940. Within 3 months, explosions were carried out here twice. In 1940, Pierre Martin delivered grenades, various weapons, and machine guns from the Maroche. I have already mentioned a young railroad worker from Salteville. His father, Robert Chevrier, picked up rifles and cartridges abandoned by French soldiers on the Châtillon-Rennes road in July 1940. These weapons were delivered to Raymond Rouault's apartment. Young communists Rémy Lebrun, André Rouault and Maurice Fournier invented their own way of obtaining weapons. They went to the Café Triumph, where Nazi officers frequented. The Nazis would leave their porta-potties in the check room. The patriots, upon entering the café, would hang their cloaks or jackets over their porta-potties and, after drinking a glass of wine, would carry the porta-potties with their weapons under their clothes. A few days before my arrival, in August 1941, Louis Coquier had miraculously escaped arrest. Commissioner Morin of the Special Brigade, at the head of a group of policemen, was searching a large apartment building where Renier workers lived. Morellin and 3 policemen broke into the apartment of the Coquier family. There they found the father, mother, and Louis's 15-year-old sister. The mother was cooking dinner. Louis was not at home. He had gone to get milk. The policemen made a thorough search, but found nothing. At this time, Louis returned home with a jug of milk. He was immediately seized and searched. Among his belongings they found a crooked key. Morin exclaimed excitedly, "Here is the key to the room where you print the leaflets." "Not at all," replied Louis. "This is the key to the apartment we are in." Louis took the key, put it in the lock and twiddled it. "Then we can try it from the outside." And before the policeman realized what was the matter, he was outside the door and locked it, locking the spies in the apartment. Louis dashed down the stairs, ran out into the courtyard and fled. Until my arrival, Louis hid with his friend Joseph Bausen in Rennes. On my recommendation, Louis moved to Paris with his fiancée. There, Louis's older sister found them an apartment. In Paris, Louis Coquier commanded a detachment of battalions of youth for more than 6 months. After the arrest of his sister and fiancée, he first rented a room under the name of Ligiard, and then lived in a hotel for a few days. On January 3, 1942, he went into a café. Suddenly the police rushed in. They demanded everyone's papers and searched the customers. Louis had a revolver, but he was unable to use it. This time he could not escape. On April 15, 1942, he was shot. His enemies had paid dearly for his life. Like other patriots, he did a lot for the victory. I know that more than anything else in the world, Louis loved life, and I remember the words of the author of one novel, which he put into the mouths of 2 people sentenced to death. One of them was a leader of the frontières and partisans, and the other was idly waiting for the Allies to land, only to make use of the weapons he had in abundance. Before his execution, the second of them, never having used his weapon, said to the first, "Dying, you at least know that if on one scale you put your life, on the other will be the lives of many enemies, you have brought the hour of victory nearer. I too am dying, but the other scale is empty." In September 1941, I arrived in Nantes. Here, the secretary of the local organization of the Union of Communist Youth, Guy Gautier, was proposing the creation of a group of battalions of youth. By decision of the Central Committee of the FCPF, Jean Vignette became the commissioner of the special organization in Brittany. He successfully led the work, but he had no connection with Paris. This was the purpose of our first meeting. Thereafter, until his arrest, we kept in regular contact with him twice a month. He was one of the best interregional leaders. then head of a subdivision of the organisation French Frontières et Partisans in the departments of Normandy and Pas-de-Calais. Vigneault was stooped, appearing about 10 years older than his age. If anyone met him and took to judge him only by external signs, he could miss the most important thing. Vigneault was distinguished by intelligence, had the talent of a major organizer. He was able to convince people, to find the right approach to each person, to raise morale. Vine gave himself entirely to work, did everything he could to expand the scope of the struggle. To all his outstanding qualities must be added great kindness and modesty. He contributed much more to the cause of liberation than in 1944, although his name has not found a worthy reflection in history. Guy Gaultier was the complete opposite of Jean Vigneault. If Vigneault was characterized by an Olympian calmness, the characteristic feature of Guy Gaultier was exceptional expansiveness. Guy managed to get a job as a courier in the field post office of the German occupation troops. This allowed him to move freely from one area to another and to direct the militant activities of the resistance organization. In October 1941, I met Guy again and spent a few days with him. We were then preparing the operation in Nantes, which was second only to the operation at the Barbie metro station. At the beginning of October 1941, the Communist Party leadership took the important decision to unite the special organization. The battalions of youth and the special groups of foreign workers, which had been operating separately. The youth showed some confusion about this decision. What did it mean to unite into a special organization? The name itself did not inspire much enthusiasm in the mind of a fighter, and of a young one in particular. Besides, our battalions already had a glorious history. For me personally, this decision did not pose any problems, because I was in constant contact with the leadership of these two organizations, with Eugene Genoff from the Special Organization and Conrado Meyer-Must, one of the leaders of the Socialist United Party of Catalonia, who commanded special groups of foreign workers. On the contrary, I became more and more convinced of the need to unite all our forces, which would ensure a more rational deployment of the leadership capable of leading our movement and better organization of interaction at all levels. It had to be done in such a way as to exclude the case when, on the basis of the same information, special groups of foreign workers and groups of our organization would gather at the same hour to derail the same train. In July, August and September 1941, we had carried out a series of combat operations, and now it was time to raise our struggle to a higher level by creating a united army of soldiers of the night under the command of a single headquarters. It was at this time that the First National Military Committee was established. Eugene Guipov was appointed political commissar, Colonel Jules Dumont was appointed military commissar, and I was assigned the duties of deputy political commissar. As Eugene Guipov was well known throughout the Paris area, for security reasons he rarely went out for meetings. I travelled regularly to the interregions in order to establish the governing military bodies there. From that time on, I often had the opportunity to meet Colonel Dumont, one of the leaders of the anti-fascist struggle before the war and throughout the occupation, until June 15, 1943, when his life was cut short by the bullets of the Punishers. For us, the young, he was not only a teacher, but also a true inspiration in the struggle. This officer of the French army was born on January 1, 1888 in Roubaix to a labour family of 12. At first he worked as an apprentice to a shoemaker, was fond of composing poems, sometimes even writing them directly on the leather from which he made the soles. From his early childhood, he was outraged by the prevailing poverty around him. He longed for social justice. At first he thought he had found his way in the theory of social Christianity, preached by the Abbé Lemaire and Marc Sagnier. After being drafted into the army, Jules Dumont quickly became a sergeant. He was sent to Morocco, where the struggle for independence had already begun. At the time, Jules Dumont sincerely believed that France and its army were bringing civilization to Morocco. The World War I had begun. Dumont regarded Wilhelm I's Germany as a symbol of European reaction. He was not deterred by the alliance of Republican France with Tsarism. He believed that he was going to defend the freedom of France, when he went to the front with a rifle and a bouquet of flowers in a joyful mood. He fought on the Somme, at Verdun, then at Salonika. Thanks to his extraordinary abilities, he finished the war in the rank of captain, became a Knight of the Legion of Honor. At the front he received several wounds, was exposed to gas poisoning. After demobilization, doctors advised him to undergo a course of treatment in the south of France. North Africa remained in his memories like a mirage. If the sun is needed, then we must go to Morocco, he decided. In Morocco, Dumont was engaged in growing apricots, breeding bees, became fascinated by the works of Maeterlinck. In Morocco, he married. From this marriage was born 2 daughters and a son. One day, the head of a mountain railway station, where Dumont then lived, offered him to read Humanite. This newspaper was banned in Morocco, and if the station master made such an offer to Captain Dumont, it means that he trusted him. The fact was that there were many Moroccans among the captain's acquaintances. Usually colonists treated them as cattle. But Jules Dumont, on the contrary, helped Moroccans, wrote various petitions for them to the colonial authorities. Jules Dumont stood up for the Moroccans because he was disgusted by social injustice and colonial oppression, which sucked the physical, cultural and spiritual juices out of the poor masses. Jules Dumont acted on his ideals. He organized farmers into a cooperative to buy agricultural equipment. Nothing like this had ever happened in France. He fought for prices that would not impoverish the farmers. The issue of Humanite that Dumont was given was black with coal dust. It had been hidden on the tender of a steam locomotive. What Jules read in the paper was a revelation to him. He was so excited that he shared his thoughts with his wife. If you did not dissuade him, but only said, "If you believe that all this is true, go this way." This is exactly what Jules Dumont dedicated his life to. Soon he was arrested. He was imprisoned for 3 months. He was stripped of his reserve officer rank and the Legion of Honor. After his release from prison, he went to Paris, took part in rallies, plunged headlong into political life. October 3, 1935, Fascist Italy attacked Ethiopia. Jules Dumont volunteered. He fought on the side of the Ethiopian army, giving it his military knowledge. Although the League of Nations decided to impose sanctions against Italy, they remained only on paper. Neither France nor any other country except the USSR took virtually no action against the aggressor. Colonel Dumont, and with him several other Frenchmen, went out of their way to save France's honour by entering the fight on the side of the suffering, poorly armed people of Ethiopia. Returning to France, Jules Dumont travelled to various cities. Everywhere he told the truth about the fascist war in Ethiopia, about the villages destroyed by bombs, about the extermination of entire tribes by Mussolini's black shirts. Then he returned to his family in Morocco and took up beekeeping again. And fascism was again knocking at the door of history, this time in Spain. On July 18, 1936, Franco, supported by colonial troops from Spanish Morocco and a number of military units stationed in Spain, rebelled to seize power. He immediately received military support from Nazi Germany, which sent him troops. Fascist Italy landed a large landing force of blackshirts in Spain. These 2 countries supplied Franco's army with military equipment and ammunition. The French rulers blocked Republican Spain, pursuing a so-called policy of non-intervention, and this at a time when there was talk of creating a popular front government. In fact, this policy meant the unilateral intervention of the Italian and German fascists on the side of the rebels. Against the policy of our government, against all odds, France Navigazione carried out clandestine arms transfers, overcoming various obstacles. The USSR used every opportunity to provide material support to the fighting people of Spain. In October 1936, in the detachment Paris Commune numbered 105 Frenchmen. Many of them had already received a baptism of fire in the battles on the side of the Spanish Republicans in Iruna and Majorca. In mid-October, the 1st International Brigade of the Best Sons of All Nations was created in Albacete. It went into battle and provided aid to the Spanish people. At dawn on November 7, 1936, Jules Dumont marched in parade formation at the head of the battalion Paris Commune, along with other parts of the Exi International Brigade in the streets of besieged Madrid. Brigade fighters took up combat positions on the university campus. For 2 years they defeated here the troops of the Frankists, German and Italian fascists. After the first heavy fighting in the university town, the struggle continued in Casa de Campo. Campus Casa de Campo. For people of my generation, these words symbolized courage and heroism. The predecessors of those who won the final victory fought the battle against fascism with weapons in their hands. On the night of December 12, the internationalists broke through the enemy front east of Casa de Campo. At dawn, the battalion Paris Commune began the offensive, seized Gumara and Molino del Viento. Jules Dumont's command centre was located in an old mill. A Nazi shell hit right into this mill, and everyone who was there was killed. Fortunately, Jules Dumont was away at the time. Death passed him by once more. A few days later, he fell ill with influenza and was very worried about being bedridden at a difficult moment in the fighting. And then he was summoned to him by the commander of the northern Madrid sector, Kleber. In Bodilla del Monte, the defence of the Republican forces did not withstand the onslaught of the enemy. "Your battalion must begin a counterattack," said Kleber, and appointed Jules Dumont chief of defence of the section Bodilla del Monte. His counterattack was a success. January 3, 1937, Dumont went to the infirmary. He opened hemoptysis. After learning that his battalion was tasked to advance, Dumont, despite the doctor's prohibition, returned to the front line and personally led his soldiers into battle. After being wounded in the leg, he was evacuated. Marcel Sagnier took command of the battalion. In February 1937, Dumont again became battalion commander and led his soldiers into battle in the Haram area, and in March in Guadalajara. In April 1937, the international brigades were reorganized by nationality. The 14th Brigade, later named the Marseillaise, was created. Jules Dumont was its commander until his return to France. Colonel Dumont came to communist ideals in a different way than most of us. However, all of us, his brothers, loved Dumont very much. Of course, he retained some of the traits of an officer in the old army, but what loyalty and courage characterized him. Our first conversation with Jules Dumont concerned the general results and goals of our struggle. Very quickly it became clear that the main actions are developing in the Paris Basin and in the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. In most other areas, including the railroads, although various diversions were carried out there, we faced the same weariness as in Paris at the very beginning, when it came to direct strikes against the Wehrmacht, against its soldiers. In addition, three organizations united by a common struggle still had to be welded together. In agreement with other members of the military committee of the special organization, we decided to create groups of branderos which were to strike in provincial cities in cooperation with our supporters who were there. This modus operandi was suggested by Colonel Dumont. I also applied it after I was appointed military commissar of the French Frontiers et Partisans and then commissioner of operations. I have only one regret. Personally, I was convinced that this method was the basic method in the guerrilla struggle, but I never succeeded in convincing all our operational leaders and all unit commanders of this. At the end of 1943, there was one incident so characteristic that it went down in the combat history of the Frontiers of France. Company Frontiers and Partisans Stalingrad, consisting mainly of escaped from captivity of Soviet soldiers, Poles, persons of other nationalities and a few Frenchmen, natives of Lorraine, passed in 1 month more than 300 kilometers and arrived in the department of Upper Saône. Almost every day this unit, getting weapons and ammunition in battle, struck German posts, derailed trains with troops and various cargoes. On all parts of the route of their actions, the partisans established communication with local frontieri and partisans. The latter supplied them with food, helped them to orient themselves in the situation, provided them with assistance as necessary. Let's return to October 1941. We had to make tangible strikes on German troops in a number of other areas in order to divert some of the enemy forces from the Paris area and from the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais, where the main forces of the suppression apparatus were concentrated. We were to launch armed attacks against the occupier garrisons. After our operations, the local forces in each district were to continue the struggle we had begun. We believed that as soon as we had destroyed a Nazi officer, the local patriots would inevitably ask themselves, were we not capable of accomplishing such tasks? Groups of Brander were to operate in the areas of the cities of Bordeaux, Nantes, Rouen. The commander of the group in Bordeaux was appointed Pierre Ribaire, who before the unification of the three combat forces was part of the special organization and carried out his work with the support of a cover group, consisting mainly of Spanish comrades. Maurice Lebert, who had destroyed the first Nazi officer at the gates of Orleans, was appointed commander of the group in Rouen. This group included Jacques Dendurin and young railroaders from Souteville-Rouen. They were all veterans of the battalions of youth. Nantes was assigned to Gisco Spartaco. a veteran of the international brigades in Spain, with two former members of the battalions of youth who had long experience in the struggle. These were Gilbert Bruslin and Marcel Borderia. In the three cities mentioned, operations were to be carried out simultaneously, or within no more than 2 days. On October 19, 1941, Maurice Lebert was the first to strike a serious blow in the Rouen section. With a group of young railroaders from Sotteville-les-Roins, he derailed a German train on the Malone-Pavine line. The Sotteville railroaders provided particularly valuable technical and material assistance. The fighters of the group quickly loosened the fastenings of the rails, cleverly disguised the violation of the electric signalling line. This method ensured the success of the sabotage and the necessary safety, since the use of explosives jeopardized the lives of our comrades. After returning from the concentration camp, Maurice Lebert wrote, "On arrival, we went to a student from Paris, an acquaintance of Dunduran, and after the operation had been carried out, we were hidden for 3 or 4 days by the Dessoubre sisters. In Le Havre, we organized an explosion in the board of the Legion of French Volunteers using a homemade mine. We were helped to carry out this operation by the workers of the Sotteville Railroad workshops. We were given another task, to destroy a Nazi officer, but we could not fulfill it because we had to leave Rouen quickly. In the neighborhood of Elbeuf, the gendarmes detained Dunduran, asked what he was carrying in his bag and wanted to search him, but he showed his original documents. One of the gendarmes had served with him in the regiment, and Dunduran was released. The newspaper France Debord described the incident in an article entitled Two Patriotic Gendarmes. The Nazis felt the force of our blows. Mass raids began, to which the whole of Normandy responded by intensifying the fight, particularly on the enemy's communication route. On October 20, 1941, a group sent to Nantes began to operate. It was successful and carried out an operation to destroy the commandant of the city of Nantes, Lieutenant Colonel Gotz. To prepare this operation, I established a personal link with our comrades in Nantes, Jean Vignette and Guy Gaultier. In this way, the support of our friends in Nantes was secured. Fabien arrived there a few days before the operation. He had to make sure that all the necessary measures were taken to ensure the group's departure after the mission was completed. The following is the written testimony of Gilbert Bruslin, 25 years after the events described. It confirms the information given in the report submitted to us by the comrades sent to Nantes. At the station at Nantes, we were met by 2 comrades, Jean Vignette and Gomicon. Gisco Spartaco set off from here with Jean Vignette. Domicon accompanied Marcel Borderia and me to his house in the suburbs of Nantes. Here we left our backpacks and went in search of a restaurant. We went into a restaurant whose owner's son was a prisoner of war in Germany, and the owner herself made no secret of her hostility to the occupiers. Subsequently, Gilbert told me that, in his opinion, the hostess of the restaurant mistook our comrades for agents of the English intelligence service. In the evening, continued Bruslin, we took refuge near Gomicon's house, and the next day we met with Gisco Spartaco and worked out a plan of acts. To derail the train, to destroy the German officer, to deliver dynamite, fuses and Bickford cord to Paris. From the railroad workers, we learned that at 6:30 in the morning on the railroad from Nantes we'll pass an echelon with German soldiers. The place was known as Sainte-Anne's. We had no information about Hitler's officers. We decided to carry out both operations at the same time and distributed between us the objects of action. Spartaco and Marcel Borderia were to derail the train. My task was to destroy the officer. The next day, October 18, 1941, we checked the condition of the explosives and detonating device. The operation was scheduled for October 19. The next day we split up and each went to his object. Spartaco and Marcel to the railroad and IID to the centre of the city. It was about 6:30 in the morning. At this time, it was not easy to meet a Hitler officer. I wheeled around the streets, but met no one. It was cool. I could not linger in one place so as not to arouse suspicion. I had 2 6.35 mm revolvers, losing faith in success. I returned to my team and found Marcel and Spartaco as unhappy as I was. They were unable to place the explosive device on the railroad track. We decided to postpone both operations until the next morning. On October 20, 1941, the 3 of us went to the railroad track. Spartaco and Marcel kept watch, while I attached the fuse and dynamite to the inside of the railroad tracks. When the job was finished, we asked Marcel to see to the completion of this operation, and Spartaco and I went in search of the officer. We approached the cathedral square, where the commandant's office was, but met no one. At about 8 o'clock in the morning, we noticed 2 senior officers walking across the square toward the commandant's office. We immediately followed them, and when we almost caught up with them, we opened fire. I shot at the Nazi walking on the right, and Spartaco at his companion. The one I shot at only managed to shriek and immediately collapsed to the ground, and I did not see what happened to the other officer, because immediately after the shots were fired, we rushed away. At the boulevard, we noticed a tramway coming from the stop. On seeing us, the driver slowed down, and the conductor helped us into the car, exclaiming, "You have certainly hit it." He was, of course, referring to the streetcar. Later, Spartaco said to me, "You know, my revolver didn't work. Something jammed it." "You're not kidding. So you didn't shoot it?" "No, but yours was a senior officer, a colonel at least." Indeed, we soon learned that I had destroyed the commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Gotz. The other turned out to be his orderly. After the Gisco operation, Spartaco and Marcel Borderia returned to Paris. At the beginning of 1942, both were arrested and shot on April 15 of the same year, so I have no precise information about how they managed to get out of Nantes, which was placed under siege. However, Guy Gaultier told me that the buses to Rennes were not checked, and that they boarded the bus at the first stop from Nantes. Gilbert Bruslin left on foot by roundabouts. He walked more than 50 kilometers in one day, sleeping in a straw stack. On the morning of October 22, he arrived by train in Paris, where Gisco Spartaco and Marcel Borderia also arrived without complications. On October 21, 1941, Pierre Ribayer, a member of the Central Committee of the FCP, killed another Nazi in Bordeaux with a pistol shot, an officer of the headquarters of the occupation forces, military advisor Reimer. The Nazis were seriously alarmed by our acts of retaliation. In 3 days, our menacing shots rang out in Rouen, Nantes, and Bordeaux. The occupiers thought that the resistance forces were active only in Paris, the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais, but now a wide variety of cities were in this sphere. The Nazis had not guessed that Parisian groups were active here, and still less did they suppose that the commandant in Nantes had been killed accidentally. The campaign of terror and intimidation waged by the Nazi authorities had by this time reached the highest point of the entire occupation. But if the French dared to destroy the commandant of Nantes, will not tomorrow be the target of attack and stealth, Nigel? The Nazis realized at the beginning of the battle for France and tried to intensify the terror, and eventually achieved that the flames of the struggle engulfed the whole of Brittany. To fight the enemy rose new forces. The day after the act of retaliation against the commandant of Nantes, Lieutenant Colonel Gotz, the press and radio unleashed an unprecedentedly vicious campaign against the frontiers and the entire resistance movement. The situation of the time must not be forgotten. To the operations in Paris, the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais in the period from October 19 to 21 were added sabotage on the railroad near Rouen, the destruction of the military advisor of the occupation troops in Nantes and a staff officer in Bordeaux. Some high-ranking German officers began to fear for their lives. However, the reasons for the widespread campaign undertaken by the media were not just that. The Nazis were trying to isolate us, to undermine the foundations of our armed struggle, which was disturbing to them. The forms of the press statements varied. The obituary spoke of Gotz as a good and brave officer, a sincere Francophile, a kind and brave Hitlerian officer. It is enough to reread the newspapers of the time to make everything clear. Since September 29, 1940, by order of Gotz in the newspaper West Eclair printed notices that revealed the depth of his Francophilia. In particular, it was said that from some time officers of the German army have increasingly complained that the agents of the French police do not salute them properly. In addition, the inhabitants do not give way to German soldiers in the streets and seats in streetcars. I asked Mr. Mayor to take all necessary measures to prevent this from happening again. Then came threats of severe sanctions. In short, if things had been different, a German army soldier on our land would still be an occupier. Our duty was simply to strike the invader daily, hourly. The Germans offered 15 million francs to anyone who would provide information to identify Gilbert Bruslin. Gisco Spartaco, Marcel Borderia, or our comrades from Nantes, who helped lavishly fawning before the Hitlerites. The mayor-collaborator added another 200,000 francs and guaranteed to keep the name of the possible whistleblower in complete secrecy. These gentlemen never received any information. Then they resorted to Kittel's directives. It must be borne in mind that in occupied countries human life in most cases means nothing. Terror can only be effective if extremely harsh measures are applied. On October 22, 1941, 27 communists from among the internees in the Chateaubriand concentration camp were shot. The Minister of the Interior of the Vichy government, Puchet, asked to do him the honour and let him choose those who should be shot. Here is a document presented after the end of the war at the Nuremberg trials. Paris, October 20, 1941. To Mr. Major Boimelberg. Mr. Major, herewith I present to you the list we talked about today. It includes the names of the most prominent communists among the prisoners of the concentration camp at Chateaubriand. The postmark on the letter indicates that it was received by Bumelberg on October 21. In turn, Chateaubriand's sous-prefect, Bernard Lecornu, wrote to the district commandant's office. In continuation of your conversation today, I have the honour to confirm that the Minister of the Interior has contacted General von Stulpagel to inform him of the names of the most dangerous communists among the concentration camp prisoners at Chateaubriand. The following is a list of 60 persons reported today for your information. Sous-prefect Bernard Lecornu. And the contents and form of this document need no comment. The occupiers demanded 27 men, they were given 60. Puchet and Lecornu did not spare the blood of their countrymen. At the same time, the sous-prefect gave a strict order to Lieutenant Touillet, commander of the gendarmerie detachment at Chateaubriand. I, the undersigned, Lecornu Bernard, sous-prefect of Chateaubriand, order Lieutenant Touillet to open fire without warning on any internee who disobeys the camp order or refuses to obey an order given. Not even the Germans dared to demand more civility from Pétain and his handmaidens. So 27 communists were selected. First on the list were the leaders of the national trade union federations who led the struggle in the factories. Angry capital couldn't disarm them, so they enlisted the help of Puchet. Most of those sentenced to execution were held in prison and internment camps for a year or more. Nowadays, some dare to claim that the resistance movement emerged in June 1941. If that were the case, many of those we mourn today would be alive. Shame on anyone who asserts such a claim, either orally or in writing. It is nothing short of sacrilege to the victims of the Chateaubriand concentration camp and to the many other active members of the resistance. It is a desecration of the grave of Charles Michel, secretary of the Trade Union Federation of Tanners, arrested on October 5, 1940. It desecrates the memory of the fall. Desire Granite, secretary of the Federation of Paper Workers, arrested on October 11, 1940. Jules Vercruis, secretary of the Federation of the Textile Workers Union, arrested on October 5, 1940. Maurice Gardate, municipal councillor of Paris, arrested on October 11, 1940. Jean Pulmark, member of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, arrested on October 5, 1940. Jean-Pierre Timbaud, secretary of the United Metal Workers Union of Paris, arrested on October 19, 1940. Jean Grandel, general councillor of the Seine Department, arrested on October 11, 1940. Henri Pourchassis, a metallurgist from Ivry, arrested at the end of 1940. Antoine Pesquet of Aubervilliers, a doctor who remained in the city during the mass flight to provide medical care for the sick and arrested on October 2, 1940. In Con Ana, a Vietnamese trainee teacher, arrested on June 18, 1941. The dissemination of such fabrications amounts to desecration of the graves of Guy Moquet, Lycée national hero, arrested on October 13, 1940, for distributing leaflets of the Union of Communist Youth, and Claude Lalate, communist student, one of the organizers of the march to the Place d'Etoile on November 11, 1940, arrested on November 27 for participating in this demonstration. It also means the desecration of the graves of the chemical engineer Victor Renel, Dr. Maurice Tenon, Pierre Guiguin, Marc Burgess, Titus Bartoli, Henry Barthélemy, Raymond Tellier, Raymond Laforgue, Emile David, Maximilien Bastard, Charles de la Vecqueraye, Edmond Lefebvre, Julien Lepans, The day of October 22, 1941, was an ominous one. Remember that? France. 16 patriots were shot at the Nantes firing range, and at Mont Valery, 5 more fell to Nazi bullets. Pierre Rigaud, Maurice Thurey's secretary, arrested on October 5, 1940, for leading underground activities in Ivry, kept a diary reflecting life in the concentration camp at Chateaubriand, and in particular made entries about that terrible day on October 22, 1941. He began by recounting the touching visit of Abbot Morleon, who arrived with the words, "I have not come to you to do violence to your conscience, but as a representative of the Chateaubrianders, I give you the testimony of their deep sympathy and love for you. I want to tell you that I am your friend. Moreover, I am your brother in love of the fatherland." Before being sent to execution, the 27 comrades gathered together in barracks number 6. Here is what Pierre Rigaud told them. 14 hours and 50 minutes. With every minute the wait becomes more agonizing, and then the Marseillaise sounded. The voices of those singing merged into a single exciting chorus, singing the battle and victory song of France. We could hardly hold back our tears when we recognized our comrades by their voices. Farewell, friends. The gates of the camp opened. A police van drove in, followed by 2 large trucks. That's for the convicts. They're afraid to shoot here. The song is getting louder and louder, but it's not the Marseillaise they sing on official occasions. We heard the Marseillaise of courage, heroism, victories, the Marseillaise of revenge. The Marseillaise faded, and the International began. Charles Michel came out of the barracks first. He calmly said to the officer, "You will see how a French deputy knows how to die." Timbaud came out second. He shouted loudly to the gendarme, "I am a simple labourer, but my work blouse is many times cleaner than your uniform," and spat in his face. A Frenchman said just as loudly to the Nazi office, "A Frenchman considers it a matter of honour to fall in battle," and then, pointing at Guy Moquet, added, "It is a crime to kill a teenager." But Guy Moquet stopped his comrade and said proudly, "Don't, Tenon, I'm a communist like you." 3 cars drove out to the quarry, in the back of each of them 9 men sentenced to execution. The first unloaded at the back of the quarry, the second waited midway down, the third further up. 27 men were shot in 3 batches of 9 men each. They sang the Marseillaise, and the singing stopped only when the shots of the punitive teams rang out. Pierre Rigaud writes further that, as the peasants who witnessed the execution told later, it seemed to them that the song continued to be sung even when the salvos of the punishers were silenced. Dr. Tenon threw the punishers the words, "Now you will see a Frenchman die." Jean-Pierre Timbaud, before the firing squad, exclaimed, "Long live the Communist Party of Germany." The Frontiers and Partisans, Professor Valentin Feldman, the poet Manushin and many others would later, when the last hour of their lives came, repeat what the metal worker Jean-Pierre Timbaud and Dr. Tin had said. This confirms the profound aims of the struggle we waged on the soil of France. It was a battle for the liberation of all peoples, including the German. On October 22, 1941, all the newspapers on the front pages reported the shootings, but no names were mentioned. That morning, I met with Colonel Dumont and Franz Bloch at the Place de Denfert-Rochereau. Claudia, as we called France, was extremely pale, visibly upset. We went into the bar and Dumont offered her a cup of coffee and a glass of wine. "Forgive me," she said. "I have just read the paper. I'm afraid Fridos is among the shot." Then, in the same breath, she continued, "We can't capitulate. That would be terrible. We must continue the struggle and avenge the fallen." Our hearts were filled with pain. Every day in the newspapers there was a mention of one or the other of the executed. The Nazis could not capture the active fighters. Then they took on their relatives and friends, our best brothers in the struggle, who were languishing in the walls. 50 more patriots were shot in Bordeaux. Almost all of them were members of the French Communist Party and the Union of Communist Youth. The poet Pierre Zegers wrote in those black days of October-November 1941, "They died for the fatherland, standing with Joan of Arc in the same ranks. Born again at the cost of their lives. I see my France. The Nazis tried to break the resistance of our people. They believed that terror was the only way to do it. In a secret directive of Field Marshal Keitel of September 16, 1941, It is stated that it should be constantly reminded and emphasized at the slightest opportunity in the course of propaganda that with the most decisive measures the local population will also be freed from criminal communist elements, thus doing them a favor. A flexible propaganda in this direction will ensure that even extreme measures against the communists will not provoke a negative reaction in favorable circles of the population. But the terror, even based on propaganda well organized by the Goebbels apparatus, led only to a strengthening of the struggle of the frontiers, to the strengthening of the resistance in all its forms. Should or should not the German occupiers have been exterminated? I can well imagine the drama that the families of those who were shot had to endure. There is no escaping it, but in those dark years we all faced the following question. Could we consider ourselves at war? 29,660 members of the resistance were shot. Most of them were active communists and most of them fought with weapons in their hands. So, according to official statistics, up to September 31, 1944, 67,078 people were killed and 75,660 people were wounded by Allied air bombing in France. I'm not getting into a principled argument. We were at war whether we wanted to admit it or not. There could be no intermediate position. Our factories were producing tanks, airplanes, military equipment for Hitler. They were as much a military facility as the factories of the Ruhr. The trains and marshalling yards provided for the dispatch of German army troops and military equipment. They had to be destroyed in the same way as the trains and marshalling yards in Germany. We can and should only discuss the manner in which these military facilities should have been destroyed. American aviation dropped bombs from high altitudes and destroyed apartment buildings, often without causing much damage directly to the military objective. British aviation was taking greater risks, but how many human lives could have been saved, in spite of the terror of the enemy, if the special organization and later the French frontiers partisans had had explosives and modern weapons? Now let us make some comparisons. The bombing of the depot at Sotteville-les-Roines on September 5, 1942, and on March 12 and 28, 1943, claimed 340 lives and wounded 1097. At the same time, a group of frontiers and partisans, led by machinist Louis Reglet, struck the depot at Maigenis through Bookmaster's intelligence network linked to the intelligence service. Our friends obtained from British intelligence the necessary explosives. 18 steam locomotives were blown into the air, and since the operation was carried out by railroad workers, the locomotives were taken out of service in such a way that it was almost impossible to restore them. During this operation, not a single person was killed. A movie was made about the Operation Jericho. It tells about the bombing of the prison in Amiens on February 18, 1944, in order to free the resistance members held there. British aviation took the risk. One plane was even shot down by German air defences. The British planes dropped bombs directly on the prison building. As a result of these actions, most of the prisoners were killed. At that time, we had several companies in this department made up of very brave members of the French Frontiers et Partisans organization. We could have liberated the prisoners ourselves, as we did at Vitry, Abbeville, Thuel, Montron, Aix-en-Provence, Pai, and in more than 20 other towns in France. It was enough to give us modern weapons and the necessary explosives. An air raid would have been much more useful if airplanes had delivered weapons to the resistance members of this department, and there would have been less danger to the British Air Force. We were paying with fewer lives for the war we were fighting on the soil of our occupied homeland. Our struggle brought the end of the war closer, the return home of the prisoners. It was the only means of countering terror. If we had not fought back the Nazi terror, it would have claimed 10 times as many lives of our people. To those who twist the facts to justify a wait-and-see policy, we ask one question. Should we have waited until all our young people were sent to hard labor in Germany to begin the struggle? When in 1943 the Nazis began to take the youth of France for forced labor, the French saw in the fighting groups those organizations that were ready to take them in and realized that, instead of forging for themselves the chains of slavery, they could contribute to the destruction of those chains. Refusing to go to work in Germany, joining fighting groups or joining the ranks of the partisans, there was no other way to defend themselves and their compatriots. In a war such as the War of 1940-1945, there was no room for passive positions. In the words of Charles Peguy, only moral collapse can explain the behavior of a man who waits for the hour of victory, but has no burning desire to go to battle for it. So the newspaper of the organization French Frontières et Partisans wrote at the time, "France cannot be liberated with foreign hands." Would we have been able to become such a nation which was waiting for its liberation by the forces of other peoples? The peoples of the USA, England, America, Canada? Should 40 million Frenchmen and Frenchwomen have obeyed the laws imposed by the occupiers, worked for them in factories and fields, that is, done everything against their own liberation? Some members of the resistance believed that the conditions were not yet ripe for an armed struggle. They suggested waiting for the Allies to land. And how could the French forces of internal resistance have arisen if the struggle against the enemy had not begun long before 1944? We would have had no forces, or they would have been very insignificant, if we had not fought for 3 long and hard years. Eisenhower estimated that the military assistance of the resistance forces was equivalent to the actions of 15 Allied divisions. During the first weeks after the landing on June 6, 1944, only 8 Allied divisions gained a foothold in the narrow bridgehead in France. Specialists are well aware that in a paratroop landing, the most critical phase of the operation is its beginning, the very first days of the battle. When June 6, 1944 was carried out landing, the Soviet troops came to the Polish border. Within a month they had already fought in Romania, and the Allied troops were on the outskirts of Rome. But Hitler still had the opportunity to throw 20 divisions against the landing. At this critical moment, when the approach of reinforcements delayed on the routes to the bridgehead, enemy troops suffered losses in manpower and equipment, undermined their morale under the continuous blows of the French forces of internal resistance. Enemy columns were ambushed on all routes. But if there were no carefully formed organizations comprehending the difficult science of guerrilla warfare, there would be no French forces of internal resistance. Here is what the authoritative historian Marcel Baudot writes about it. All those directly involved in the leadership of the underground struggle cannot help but recognize that such tactics are deeply justified, and it is only regrettable that other organizations that were part of the resistance movement much later began to be guided by these tactics. The action began with the creation of groups of brigades, which would strike at a certain point, then quickly withdraw from that area to strike at another place at a considerable distance from the first object, in such a way that agents of the suppression organs could not pick up their trail. To exhaust, to crush morale, to exsanguinate the army of occupation. That was the battle slogan of the frontieros and partisans. They did not wait until the Allied armies arrived to then begin guerrilla actions behind enemy lines, did not limit themselves to collecting intelligence on enemy troops. The occupiers understood the significance of the new tactics of struggle that were being employed by the French Communist Party. General von Stulpnagel, in a report for January 1942 Reporter, of the 68 assassination attempts that took place in the Paris area between August 1941 and January 3, 1942, 22 were quite understandable. Among the attempted assassins, communists constituted a very small number. They were mostly willing young men. The communist terrorists were characterized by the fact that they possessed a poison designed to kill themselves in case of arrest. They sought to provoke strikes, passive resistance, to weaken the military potential in the occupied zone. In an effort to aid our enemies, they endeavored to force us to keep large contingents of troops in the occupied zone to maintain order. By such actions, the very idea of establishing a new order in Europe was to fail in France. In all likelihood, the commander of the occupation troops in France once again familiarized himself with General Ludendorff's book Total War. Apparently, therefore, he did this time without insults to the French frontieros. The chief of staff of the German army in 1914-1918 wrote in his book, "Ultimately, in politics, only the strong decides what the laws and their interpretation should be, and a people's war waged in the rear of a victorious army is in full accordance with international law. The calamities inflicted on the people are the cause of people's wars. Such a war is possible only when the people have a deep unity and have decided to fight for their existence. This is exactly what the people of France had in common between 1940 and 1944. One of the members of the military tribunal in occupied France, Hans Dortzel, writes, "In my opinion, the first precursors of the resistance movement in France were already felt at the time of my arrival there in September 1940. Numerous sabotage, damage to communication lines at first glance gave reason to consider them isolated actions. But on closer examination of these facts, it was possible to conclude that all these actions were directed by a certain combat organization. At the initial stage, the resistance forces caused little material damage. On the other hand, from the very beginning, these actions were of great ideological importance to the enemy and posed a serious threat to us. The general situation in the West initially created a feeling of insecurity in the troops. This feeling was constantly growing, and no countermeasures were able to eradicate it. I believe that all these measures were completely ineffective, although they were periodically implemented. General von Stulpnagel, the creator of the hostage code, was of the same opinion. He said, shootings lead to the fact that the friends of the executed in factories, in educational institutions, offices, and neighborhoods, in turn become franchisees. If Otto von Stulpnagel reconsidered his position, he did so not out of kindness of heart, but in the interest of Germany. He announced this to Ernst Junger. On February 23, 1942, at 6 o'clock in the evening, the German writer was invited to tea to the Commander-in-Chief of the occupation forces. Otto von Stulpnagel called him for a conversation on these matters before his resignation. Junger writes in his diary. He outlined the tactical motives of his opposition. The industrial potential had to be treated with a sense of proportion. Industries could produce the more output, the better things went in the country itself. Of the greatest importance was the unforeseen turn of events which occurred in the campaign in the East. Beyond all expectation, he insisted that by carrying out massive repressive measures, a great service was being rendered to the resistance movement in France. This may also explain the point he made. The repression went far beyond its intended purpose. Documents from the German archives confirm the content of this conversation. Otto von Stulpnagel repeatedly offered Hitler's bet his way out of the situation, having already 6 months of experience of shootings carried out on his orders. In France, he was even the initiator of all shootings. He demanded to arrest as many communists as possible, especially among the youths, who are the main supplier of criminals, and, if possible, to carry out a mass shipment of young people to hard labor in Germany. In early February 1942, Stulpnagel arrived at Hitler's headquarters, but was not received. After a serious spat with Keitel, he returned to Paris and asked for retirement. In a letter to the Führer Ossedian Stulpnagel, with good reason I can assert that during my tenure as Commander-in-Chief in France, for the most part there was mostly calm and order, and the country with maximum benefit was widely used in the interests of the war, and all this went far beyond the terms of the armistice. Regarding the Franc-Tireurs, he reported, French public opinion was privy to the fact that these were small terrorist groups, hard to catch even for the German and French police, who could not be compelled to abandon the continuation of the struggle by the most extreme repressive measures. This can only be done by uncovering and defeating their organization. On February 16, 1942, Hitler accepted the retirement of Otto von Stulpnagel and appointed Corps General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel in his place. Hitler, however, was concerned about the situation that had been created in France by the activities of the Communist Party. He initially decided to send Nazi General Bach-Silewski, the founder of the Auschwitz camp, there as the SS representative to coordinate all punitive activities, but the latter had a heavy task of fighting partisans in Ukraine and Belarusia, and there was no one to replace him. Thus, we got SS General Oberg. Himmler's deputy Heydrich arrived in Paris on May 7, 1942, to present Oberg to the French rulers. At this meeting, next to Heydrich and Oberg were Prime Minister Pierre Laval, Minister of the Interior Puchet, Commissioner for Jewish Affairs Darquire de Pellepoix, Secretary General of the Vichy Police de Brinon, Secretary General of the Ministry of the Interior Gilher, and others. But neither mass and merciless repression nor brutal torture. Nothing could stop the struggle that had been launched. Joseph Kessel, who lived through these times and returned to England, wrote stirring lines about the communist struggle in his book. We are all fighting the same battle, but we know that it is on the communists in particular that the enemy falls with particular fierceness. We also know that they are the bravest, that they are better organized. They help us and we help them. They love us and we love them. It's very simple. I don't know a single person in the resistance movement who talks about the communists without a special expression of joy in his voice and on his face. This expression is extremely serious. Speaking of the shootings, he continued, the Frontiers have created a veritable army. The number of German corpses has increased so much that the enemy has been forced to abandon the hostage system. He can no longer count on executing 100 Frenchmen for one German killed, in which case he would have to destroy all of France. The enemy openly recognized that France had conquered terror. It was at this time that the following lines reached. Frontières de France. To arms? That's the cry from behind the bars. Frontières de France. To arms. Sing your song with us. Frontières de France. To arms? If you don't have it, get it in battle. Louis Aragon, like an echo, echoed the final lines of the suicide letter of the young Lycée Guy Mackay, shot at Chateaubriand. You, the living, be worthy of us, 27, going to execution? In August, September, and October 1941, we consciously adopted the traditions of the Frontières of 1814 and 1870-1871 as if to continue the struggle begun by those patriots who were inspired by the heroes of Erckmann's and Chatrian's books. These woodcutters and wood carriers in the Vosges elected the shoemaker Claude Gullin as their leader. Men and women, Alsatians, Lorrainians, Vosgesians in 1814, for many months smashed the armies of monarchical Europe, in whose convoys the French nobles returned to their possessions. 1814-1770, 1940-1944. These years constitute, as it were, one breath of history, one people's war, a struggle for their republic. The people took the fate of national independence and freedom into their own hands. But the war of 1939-1945 is fundamentally different from all the previous ones. In 1940-1944, we were destined to cross arms with fascism, with the most brutal form of suppression, the utterly violent, the terrorist form of the domination of big capital. We were confronted with an occupier who had elevated terror to the rank of state policy. Torture, prisons, death camps, punitive commands. The science of extermination, tens of millions of people in all the countries of Europe were exterminated with its help. In 1814, and especially in 1870, there was room for some hope in the native land. An entire army, the Loire Army, continued to fight the enemy. In 1870, from the depths of history, the people's chant of 1792 resounded. Behind enemy lines, Gambetta was putting weapons into the hands of the frontières and the entire population. In 1941, our homeland, with the complicity of Pétain, was given into slavery to the Nazi occupiers. A new army had to be created. Everything was given with difficulty in the first years. But once ignited, the flames of struggle swept across the country. The French Communist Party already in 1944 saw the possibility of armed struggle. Then its leadership was instructed to collect weapons abandoned by the French army. In July 1940, they could not yet determine the exact time and form of this struggle, but it was clear that one day it will begin on a large scale. This was the direction in which the creation of the special organization was heading. In occupied France, it was the first armed organization created by the French Communist Party. The special organization was composed only of communists. In April 1942, together with the battalions of youth and special groups of foreign workers, it laid the foundation for the creation of the organization French Frontières et Partisans, which could be joined by all patriots. In 1940, it could only be a matter of strike groups to cover the distributors of posters, flags, and leaflets. Periodically, operations were carried out to disrupt the German army's telephone communications. Nevertheless, the special organization created in 1940 initiated new forms of armed struggle. Some people confuse the process of development of armed struggle against the occupiers with political resistance. In practice, political struggle gave birth to armed struggle and constantly breathed life into this more developed form of struggle. People forget that the armed struggle was made possible by the existence of an already formed, organized resistance, which created rear bases for its conduct and provided the necessary patriotic support during the fighting. In turn, the battles fought by the frontieros influenced all other forms of struggle. New conditions appeared for the distribution of underground newspapers and leaflets and for the development of a nationwide movement. This mass resistance served as the basis for all actions until the last days of the occupation and eventually merged with the armed struggle. In 1941, the armed struggle was at an early stage of development, but this does not mean that it had just begun. In fact, It must be said that by this time all forms of struggle against the occupiers had risen to a higher level. Armed struggle in no way meant the action of lone individuals. It was a new aspect of the resistance that had begun in 1940. Of course, there were also individual actions of individual daredevils who did not belong to any organization. The decision of the French Communist Party in July 1941 to launch an armed struggle on a large scale was decisive. Throughout the second half of 1941, the whole of 1942, and the beginning of 1943, the FCP had to overcome in its ranks and among the people the restraint and even resistance to the creation of the special organization and then the organization of the French franchise et partisans for 3 long years, and especially at the beginning of this period, the armed struggle was faced with many difficult problems. The transition from the usual forms of work, distribution of leaflets and newspapers, strikes, various demonstrations, to a completely new form. Armed struggle caused a number of difficulties. All other forms of struggle were familiar to us from the time of the labor movement and the French Communist Party, although now there is a serious danger for the participants in these struggles. As for armed struggle, it had to be learned from the basics. The veterans of the international brigades, or as we called them, the veterans of Spain, were the first volunteer freedom fighters. Once again, they volunteered in the same battle against fascism. They were never given credit, especially for the difficult initial period of 1941-1942. The fight of the frontieros was completely different from that of the international brigades. Now there was no front as such. One had to learn how to fight in the course of battles. Back then we called it fighting while building an organization while fighting. The idea of armed struggle had been nurtured for a long time, and our fighters were prepared for it in advance by the leadership of the Communist Party. Personally, I will always remember what Daniel Casanova said to me in May 1940. From now on it is necessary to pay attention to the army in order to continue the struggle on a national scale. The newspaper Humanite for May 20, 1940, posted material that revealed this line of work. If they are allowed to do so, the villains who dominate the country will take us down the path of new disasters. In due course, Thiers agreed to the extremely harsh peace terms put forward by Bismarck in return for his help in suppressing the Commune. 69 years later, collaborators are ready to sacrifice the independence of the motherland to Hitler, just so long as he preserves their capitalist privileges. On June 6, 1940, as the Nazis began their offensive on the Somme, Benoit Franchen, on behalf of the underground leadership of the FCP, handed the following proposals to Georges Politzer for transmission to the government. 1. To change the nature of the war, to turn it into a struggle for national independence and freedom. 2. Release all communist deputies and Communist Party activists, as well as tens of thousands of imprisoned and interned workers. 3. Immediately arrest the enemy agents swarming in both houses of Parliament, in the various ministries, and even in the General Staff, and organize a show trial for them. 4. These first steps would inspire the people and ensure the creation of a mass militia. 5. It is necessary to arm the people and turn Paris into an impregnable fortress. Jean Amerix, in his book June 18, 1940, quotes Churchill. English statesman at this tragic time, without realizing it, joined the position of the leadership of the FCP. Paris must be defended, he said. Agent Amuru further writes, Churchill is looking for what else to throw into the battle. This is what he says about Paris. It is a huge city. You can fight on the approaches to it and in the central part. You can fight in the great squares and in the alleys and at every crossroads. You can defend it in every block, in every street, in every house. It is hard to imagine how many enemy troops can enfold and swallow up a large city like Paris. Whole armies might find their grave in it. Weygand did not seize this opportunity. He declared it's all meaningless now. Completely differently acted troops and population in Leningrad and 2 years later in Stalingrad. On the night of June 6, 1940, the government of Paul Reynaud was reorganized. De Monzy, removed from his post, remained one of the figures close to the Prime Minister. General de Gaulle joined this last government of the Third Republic and was appointed Secretary of State for Military Affairs. In the government he found himself in that minority which considered it necessary to fight the battle both in metropolitan France and abroad. During the last reorganization of the government, before May 18, 1940, Paul Reynaud introduced Marshal Pétain as his deputy. The latter soon obtained an unquestioning, obedient majority in the government. On June 16, 1940, Paul Reynaud resigned, and Pétain immediately extracted from his briefcase, long before that, prepared a list of his ministers: Weygand, Darlan, Baudouin, etc. All of them are supporters of Castillism. All of them supporters of surrender and cooperation with Hitler. The next day, June 17, in a radio address, the Marshal of France demanded the cessation of hostilities. Our country was covered with shame. In the first hours afterward, however, the first glimmers of hope became visible in the twilight over France. On the very day that Pétain capitulated, a simple prefect resisted the Nazis. His name was Jean Moulin. He was prefect of the Department of Air et Eauière, and during the war he became the first president of the National Council of the Resistance. In the prefecture of Chartres, Jean Moulin learned that the Nazis had committed a crime in the small village of Louré in the Druex region of 500 inhabitants. An elderly woman named Bourgeois protested that the soldiers had occupied her house. For this, the woman was tied to a tree in the garden and shot in the presence of her daughter. In the evening, 2 Nazi officers appeared at the prefect's office and demanded that he sign a statement that 2 Senegalese infantrymen had committed atrocities in the commune of St. George's, near Chartres. Jean Moulin was required to certify that French colonial soldiers had massacred the inhabitants and raped the women. The prefect refused to put his signature to this statement. In the days of the Popular Front, Jean Moulin had been chief of the secretariat of the Minister of Aviation Pierre Cotte, and now he had experienced Nazi atrocities, abuse and beatings. He was arrested. The Nazi officers told him, "Since we now know of your love for Negroes, we have decided to give you the pleasure of spending the night with one of them." Jean Moulin later wrote, "In the darkness, the glorious Senegalese gave me a place on the only mattress here, and himself lay down at the side. I handed him blankets because on the floor lay shards of glass from broken windows during the bombardment. I knew that this time my strength is at an end, and if tomorrow everything starts again, I will not endure. The question before me became more and more acute: to sign the statement or to continue the struggle, to run away. I could constantly hear the sound of sentries' footsteps, not only from the corridor, but also under the only window of the cell. So I decided not to sign it. I did not want to be an accomplice in a vile deception, which could only be fabricated by mad sadists. Anything but that, even death. Why death? At the very beginning of the war, I would have accepted it, like many thousands of Frenchmen. Since then, I've seen it many times very close by. It does not frighten me. I have done my duty, or rather, I will do it to the end, if I do not allow our enemies to dishonor us. The Boche will see that a Frenchman can sacrifice his life for a common cause. I'd already figured out how to use the shards of glass lying on the floor. Cut his throat with them. Once the decision is made, it is easy to move on to practical action to realize what you consider your duty. During the night, the Nazis found Jean Moulin in a pool of blood. He was taken to a hospital and doctors saved his life. On November 2, 1940, Pétain removed him as prefect. Jean Moulin became one of the many guerrillas acting alone at the time, ready to fight for freedom in the underground. On the same day, June 17, Edmond Michelet, a grocery agent in Brive, was watching the flow of refugees. He saw neither Mama Edwidge, nor René Romagan, nor Alice Cuvier, and the 3 of them had come from Troyes that day on bicycles. After passing through Jussel, they arrived in St. Angel, turned off the National Highway 89, and found themselves in a small commune called Palace. Mama Edwidge knew that my father's house stood in the village of Ari, and that my uncle and aunt lived there. The house had been built 2 centuries ago, and had only 1 room, 9 by 6 meters in size with 1 meter thick walls. The 3 women who arrived were housed in the bakery. After living for more than a month, they left back to Troyes. Edmond Michelet did not meet my parents or Alice Cuvier, but he saw other refugees arriving in Brive for days on end. He saw women, children and old men fleeing south, driven like a herd. The father of the large family, Edmond Michelet, was active in Catholic organizations. His son Claude would later say, "Yes," he cried when the Germans entered Paris on June 14. He immediately had the desire to fight one way or another by any means necessary, if only to set an example, if only he could finally feel the relief of actively resisting the enemy. So on June 17, at the very time when de Gaulle was sharing his thoughts with Churchill about his intention to continue the struggle, my father drafted his first leaflet. Together with Frederick Malloy, a typewriter merchant from Brive, he reproduced an excerpt from Charles Peguy's book Money, which includes, among other things, these: "He who does not surrender will triumph over he who surrenders. In time of war, I am on the side of he who does not surrender, regardless of his party affiliation. Only a scoundrel can surrender a city, even if he is the churchwarden of his parishioners." When Edmund Michelet produced the first packet of leaflets, patriots in Brive who held different political views, Catholics, socialists, communists, distributed them throughout the town. It was already a prototype of the kind of alliance that had developed during the years of the resistance, when Edmund Michelet fought alongside his compatriot and friend Germain Obiaru, a resident of Brive, federal secretary of the party organization, until he was arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp. It is not without excitement that I now reread this yellowed sheet. I've been assured that it was one of the first, and perhaps even the very first, printed word of the resistance in France itself. The beginning of our June 1940 leaflet read: "Whoever surrenders to the enemy, whoever he is, wherever he comes from, whatever party he belongs to, is my enemy. And I hate him all the more, and I despise him all the more, because by switching from one political party to another he intended to breed with me." Edmund Michelet's deep devotion to the ideas of the resistance, his desire to unite, all this we should not forget. Many men and women of different political views, believers like Edmund Michelet, atheists like Jean Moulin, did not accept humiliation, did not surrender. This is exactly what General Charles de L'Estrange did. Born March 12, 1879 in Bayeux-Saint-Vias, he devoted himself to military service. Having brilliantly graduated from the Saint-Cyr Military School in December 1913, in the rank of captain, he was appointed company commander of the 151st Infantry Regiment. He was then reassigned to the Jaeger Regiment, where he was caught by the outbreak of war in 1914. On August 30, 1914, after heavy fighting in Belgium and on the Maas River, Officer Charles de L'Estrange was taken prisoner. He experienced the life of a prisoner of war in an officer's camp, much like Captain de Gaulle. After his release from captivity, he continued his military service. In 1930, he became a lieutenant colonel serving in a tank school. In 1932, he took command of the 505th Tank Regiment. On December 23, 1936, the Popular Front government promoted him to the rank of general. Following General Etienne in 1919, and later Colonel de Gaulle, with whom he had a friendly relationship, General Charles de L'Estrange was one of the first to put forward the idea of using tank formations. In 1937, at the Lucerne range, he gave a practical demonstration of the great role of tanks in combat, showing the interaction of tanks with aviation and with units of other branches of the army. In May 1940, when he was not in the regular army, the government again asked for his help. He was given command of a tank group. Despite his combat experience and the heroism of his tank crews, he was unable to do anything against the treachery in the government and at army headquarters. On July 8, 1940, with a pained heart, he bade farewell to his soldiers at Camp Caillou. His speech sounded like an exemplary refusal of surrender and humiliation to the occupiers. He sees, Agnac is now suffering a terrible catastrophe. The cause is general weakness. Nevertheless, it depends on us and above all on you young people to make sure that France does not perish. We are not yet fully aware of the anxieties and heavy losses that await us. So let us meet these new trials with courage, full of energy and full of faith in success. If we remain faithful to the destiny of our homeland, if we act like true Frenchmen, if we do not resemble the psychology of beaten dogs or slaves, if we are able to show our will, the day will come when France will emerge victorious from this difficult ordeal. I urge you, I repeat once again, believe, necessarily believe, and always believe in our victory. General Charles de L'Estrange, living in Bourg-en-Bresse, kept in constant touch with some officers, non-commissioned officers and soldiers, especially from among those who served in the tank forces. He brought them together under the guise of a corporation of co-workers. When, at the end of 1942, he completed the creation of the secret army, which included military and paramilitary organizations, he expressed to us his admiration for the battles that had already been fought for more than a year in the occupied zone by the frontiere and partisans. In his work, he applied the same tactics that Jean Moulin had applied to the various underground organizations of the resistance. We met with him in a house in the Rue Lenotre in the XVV arrondissement of Paris. I had to arrange with him for the ejection by parachute of weapons for the frontieres and the partisans. I have never made a distinction with regard to the soldiers subordinate to me because of their political opinions, he told me. When the weapons are airlifted to us, you will get what is due you, considering that you have to fight hard. Unfortunately, our dear comrade was arrested on June 6, 1943, at the Muette metro station in Paris and sent to Dachau. On April 19, 1945, the Nazis announced his release from the camp, but by special order of the Munich Gestapo, they shot him dead. In 1940, such people as Jean Moulin, Edmond Michelet, General de Lestrade Lully, lone figures who refused to submit to the occupiers, were widely known. And along with these illustrious names, how many other ordinary, little-known people acted in the same way, and how many among them were active communists, prepared for this by all the previous struggle. Here are two examples out of several thousands. Maurice Libert, who killed a Nazi officer in Paris, and Marcel Linnet. From 1939 to 1940, they headed a centre in Dravale that published all the underground newspapers exposing the treachery of the ruling classes and the strange war. On June 12, 1940, they loaded a duplicator, paper, typewriter on the trunks of their bicycles and left Paris. This was during a period of mass flight. They had lost contact with the Communist Party leadership, but duty demanded that they continue their propaganda work, exposing the perpetrators of all that had happened. Continuously for 4 days they printed leaflets and distributed them to the soldiers and civilians fleeing south. The leaflets were signed very simply, French Communist Party. June 17, heavy bombardment forced Maurice Libert and Marcel Dinard to take refuge in one of the cellars in Sully-sur-Loire. That day, writes Maurice Libert, we lost everything. Bicycles, typewriter, duplicator, only we ourselves managed to save ourselves. But it's almost symbolic. At the same time, Edmond Michelet in Brive, along with a typewriter salesman, took up the baton at another point in the country. It is likely that what the young communists Maurice Libert and Marcel Linnet wrote was different in style from the pamphlets of Pigalle and Edmond Michelet. They must have emphasized the responsibility of those who had surrendered the country. But what united all three of them was a France that was now preparing to go into battle. Despite their different expressions of thought and their adherence to opposing philosophies, they were united in their condemnation of treachery and the occupiers. Stars of hope lit up in the night. On June 18, 1940, from London, English radio broadcast a proclamation from General de Gaulle in which he supported the supporters of resistance to the occupiers and declared his intention to continue the struggle in alliance with England. This war is not confined to the battle for France. There is a world war going on. All the mistakes, all the delays, all the suffering will not prevent the world from finding the necessary forces capable of one day defeating our enemies. Having suffered defeat from mechanized troops today, we will be able to win in the future with superior enemy mechanized troops. On this depends the fate of the world. Being at present in London, I, General de Gaulle, ask French officers and soldiers, both those in England and all those arriving here with and without arms, as well as engineers and skilled workers in the armament factories, to establish communication with me. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must not and will not be extinguished. In the future, as I do today, I will be speaking on London radio. On June 19, 22, 24, 26, and 28, de Gaulle again spoke on the radio. The proclamation he signed read, France has lost the battle, but has not lost the war. Now, by mistake, this poster is often passed off as the proclamation of June 18, 1940. London radio became an important means of addressing the people of France. Responding to academician Francois Mauriac, London radio announcer Maurice Schumann said on August 17, 1904, "One must not be ashamed of the love of liberty. One must be ashamed of the fact that it has been badly defended, not only on the battlefield but also in peacetime in one's own home." In form, such statements were close to what the communists were saying. To win back freedom, national independence and respect for human dignity. And here is what the General Secretary of the FCP, Maurice Thorez, assessed the proclamation of June 18, 1940. From London, General de Gaulle also addressed a proclamation to the resistance forces. He declared the armistice a crime. He began to organize the first detachments of the new national army. Inside the country, contacts began to be established between communists and Gaullists. In the course of the struggle for a common cause, for the liberation of France, there was a desire to unite all patriots. Of course, one might ask how many French people heard the proclamation on June 18, 1940. People were then on the road. There were no radios available. During the whole period of occupation, many people listened to London radio, and no more listened to it in June 1940 than at present. However, some newspapers in the south of France printed excerpts of the speech. The effect of this proclamation can also be debated. Jean Amourou wrote on June 18, 1940, Charles de Gaulle entered the historical arena, but France did not hear him. France was on the roads in the packed cities of the southwest and south, in prisoner of war camps. On June 18, France spoke of only one proclamation, only one speech, made the day before by Marshal Pétain, in which he declared the need to stop fighting and ask for an armistice. France agreed to it. That is probably true. I was a prisoner of war at the time, and it is difficult for me to judge this. But one thing is clear. General de Gaulle's position, which goes against the general weakness referred to by General d'Elestrade, is beyond praise. One may disagree with General de Gaulle's assessment of the causes of the defeat. But these minor aspects aside, the proclamation of June 18, 1940 brought an element of confidence of the utmost importance to the resistance movement. It also served to establish the French Committee for National Liberation and a provisional government in Algeria, which included the communists Francois Bayou and Fernand Grenier, the socialists Lettre Coq and Adrien Tixier, the radicals Mendes France and Henri Kay, from the social Christians François de Menton, and representatives such as Louis Jacquinot from the Senate. When we were close to success in 1943-1944, this alliance promoted a powerful and broad unification of all the forces that put into practice the thesis put forward by General de Gaulle. Armed national insurrection is in sight. In June and July 1940, we were still far from this. Few sought to stay in England or to go to see de Gaulle in London. In the fields of France, political parties, large state institutions, the church, all resembled gardens devoid of greenery, and all was devastated, overrun by the avalanche of the German lance-bearer and the disease of Pétainisme. And only one single party, the Communist Party, from September 1939 onwards, under these conditions, comprehended the hard science of the underground, rebuilt itself, lived a full-blooded life and took a firm stand.